Oh boy, have I got a scoop for you. Here's the headline. It's that time of the week again. The Rockin Pop-Up, when we talk rocks with our rock jocks. I'm going to be bringing in some special correspondences today. Gavin and Graham, the Geology Gents. Greetings, gents. What's the skinny on today's program?
How you doing, Marisa? Well, we got some news for you. Today we're jumping into some science news. We're going to be talking about how we go from scientific conclusions to news you might see on the newsstands out to the public. How's that sound?
Wow, that sounds like some hard-hitting news. But before we dive into that, I want to make sure that everyone at home knows that we got a slew of stories just like this. So when you get a moment, dig on into the archives right here on Facebook or head over to our website where there's plenty of more resources for exploring science. And on that note, why don't you all get to type in the comments, let us know your favorite place to get your science news. What are you listening to? What are you reading? What are you watching? We want to know. And without further ado, take it away, gents.
Thanks for that, Marisa. All right.
Thanks, Marisa. Yeah, so today, Gavin and I have quite the scoop. We're going to take you through the exciting world of the scientific process. So last time, Gav, we talked about how we sort of get science done in the research part of it. But as scientists, we do a lot more than just collecting data and dating rocks and coming to conclusions. Isn't that right?
That's right, Graham. You have to ask, what are our intentions as scientists? And that is to push forward the knowledge of that humans have, and us specifically about the world. And so part of that, and perhaps a major part of that, is getting our science out to the public, disseminating that information to something that's interesting to the public and piques the public interest and teaches people about the things that we're working on. Would you agree with that, Graham?
Definitely, Gavin. And really, at the end of the day, science is, it's for the benefit of humanity. That certainly part of it is that we're interested and curious and want to learn more, but we aren't the only ones who are interested and curious and want to learn more. So it's our scientific duty to be making sure that the things we learn and the things we study are able to be shared not only with other scientists, but are able to go into the hands of the public and policymakers and decision makers so that they can use science and a better understanding of the world to help shape the decisions they make.
That sounds great, Graham. And so I think that a good way of bringing this to the audience today in today's Rockin Pop-Up is to start off with a few headlines, some scientific headlines that from recent science that's coming out, some things you might find on any news source you might see, whether it be CNN, Fox, something like that, or a specifically science news source online or over the radio or something like that. So we'll start with that, and we'll go all the way back to where we left off last week, and that was the scientific conclusions that we as scientists make. So we're going to take the audience through the process that an idea, a scientific conclusion goes through by the time it gets to your news feed.
Gavin, that sounds great. I can't wait to go through this with you. But before we dive into that, do I have a tasty headline for you? Oh. And so, Gavin, this is hot off the presses. This is brand new science news today. And this is this was a headline on Science News, which is a science news source. But coming from this research article titled "Modeling the Maximal Active Consumption Rate and Its Plasticity in Humans: Perspectives from Hot Dog Eating Competitions." So, Gavin, what are they finding out here?
Well, Graham, so the author of this article, James Smalia, he's doing some pretty serious mathematics. He's doing real research, and that is studying how much humans can eat and how fast. And he's using hot dog eating contests as an analog for this study, but he's doing research really on the biology of humans, how they eat, and what are the limits of human eating. And so, Graham, this is kind of a silly headline, but it's coming from a serious science source, right?
That's right. So this has been published in a peer-reviewed journal, and hold that thought. We'll talk about what peer review means later. But this is a qualified and tested and critically reviewed scientific study in a very reputable journal. And the scientists here, they're using well-established mathematical techniques. They're doing some mathematical modeling to understand these systems, and they're really getting at these sort of fundamental limits of animal bodies, the way that they can actually consume food, albeit in the terms of a hot dog eating competition, where it seems that about the fastest a person can eat a hot dog is just a little bit above or just a little bit below 8 francs per minute, which I don't think I could even come close to, if I'm going to be honest with you, Gavin.
Oh man, Graham, I wouldn't want to do that, but our buddy Joey Chestnut, the hot dog eating master over here, might. And so his records might sort of plateau off in the coming years. We'll have to watch for next Coney Island hot dog eating contest on the 4th of July to see.
That's right. And I'm sure it must be quite the challenge for all those competitive eaters out there to be faced with the very limits of the human ability to chow hot dogs.
That's right, Graham. And so, okay, so he publishes this article and it gets picked up by a news source, and that's sort of what we're going to be talking about today. But let's bring it a little bit closer to our areas of expertise with a less delicious but still scientifically interesting headline. What else do you got for us?
Yeah, so I gotta stop clicking around on here. Okay, so I've got something here about iron volcanoes on ancient metal asteroids. So for those who are not meteorite buffs, there are a couple different kinds of meteorites we get on Earth. There's rocky ones, and then there's iron ones, these metal meteorites that came from these metal asteroids. And so, Gavin, never before had anyone really suggested that these things might have metal volcanoes on them. But what are these scientists showing?
Well, Graham, these scientists, and I have to shout out these scientists, Jacob Abrahams and Francis Nimmo. These are 2 geologists from UC Santa Cruz. So this is coming from close. They did some mathematical modeling and figured out, well, when these asteroids were first forming, their cores were so hot and under such pressure that the metal inside these asteroids might have actually spewed out onto the surface of the asteroid as a metal volcano. And Graham, what happened? This is actually a Fox News source, right? So someone got wind of this and made it into a headline that the public made for public consumption, right?
That's right. Yeah. So this was such a cool, exciting story, right up there with how many hot dogs a human could possibly eat. And it got picked up by a science news source. This is Fox News' SciTech, science news venue. And, they took this very technical, very, physics-based paper, lots of math in there that I don't understand. And they helped to break it down and get it into bite-sized factoids that even folks like us or any other news reader could start to understand something about this really interesting idea of metal volcanoes on ancient asteroids.
Cool, Graham. Okay, so you brought us through something that generally happens between a scientific conclusion and a headline, and that is folks, journalists to be more specific, are basically picking up these science stories and they're interacting with the scientists, and we'll get into how this happens a little bit more in a bit, but they're interacting with the scientists and they're able to disseminate this information in a way that's easier, more palatable to understand for people who don't really understand all the technicalities. And so, as we said, we're going to go through and actually take a specific project and talk about it in terms of the headline that you might see in the news, and then we're going to step it back and all the way back to the scientific conclusion. And so what headline are we going to do for that, Graham, today? We have one more.
That's right. And so we're going to talk about something that's very near and dear to both of our hearts and the background behind us, and that's Antarctica and ice on Antarctica. So this was a recent news story through Nova, which maybe some of you out here indulge in for some of your science news. And they're looking at a study that involved a bunch of scientists looking at Thwaites Glacier. And Gavin, what's one of the big takeaways they got from this study that made it into this note that became the headline of this NOVA article?
Well, Graham, they're finding that underneath the glacier, there's warm water. And so this glacier is what they call an at-risk glacier because it's at risk of melting back. And as the climate shifts, the glacier is receding. And what this group of scientists, one of them being Slavik Tulichik, a glaciologist at UCSC, is doing is trying to figure out what's going on at the bottom of the glacier, because that can tell them how the glacier is going to move in the future. And they can use mathematical models along with those observations to figure out how this glacier and generally how the ice of the world is going to respond to climate change. And so that's why the NOVA is picking up on this article, is because it's a pretty interesting article for the public at large, because the public wants to know about climate change. Isn't that right, Graham? Does every single bit of science get picked up, or is it select bits of science?
It's often select bits of science. So many, very important articles, but things that aren't quite as, exciting to the public will get published and not make it into a major news source. But things that are really important for people to know, or for policymakers and decision makers to know, those are often going to get picked up and used by, or published by these news outlets. And the really key thing about what they do, Gavin, is they're taking these really technical, complicated ideas, and then they help to distill them down into really important either visuals or sound bites or ideas. And nothing is quite so compelling or informative, I think, as diagrams like this one here, where it's showing all these different parts of the glacier. And this is something that tends to be kind of special and relatively unique to these news projects, right? Where it's getting distilled down like this.
That's right, Graham. Yeah. So as we said, you have to start with really technical information. And so news sources will work with the scientists and will hire artists to make schematics like this one that describe a really, really important but very complex process. In this case, how underwater currents are interacting with the glacier. And they do a really nice job at making these beautiful figures. And so oftentimes what the public sees is an artist's rendition of the science. And so this is a really important aspect.
Yeah. So, and so I also like there how you alluded to the more technical side of things. So before we start making, seeing news stories like this, it all starts somewhere. And what is that, Gavin?
Well, Graham, that's where we left off last week. And so last week we talked about how you go from a scientific idea to a conclusion. Well, this is what happens to that conclusion. The scientists, in this case, a big group of scientists working on Thwaites Glacier, they did their study, they tested their hypothesis using the scientific method, but they weren't done once they figured it all out. They had to write up all of their conclusions and all of the data aspects of things and how their experiments were running, and they have to put it into a scientific journal. And Graham, can you describe to me what about these scientific journals are special? Can any old wahoo out there just write something up and give it to a scientific journal and have it come out as gospel of science?
No, Gavin, and you ask a really good question there. A really key part of scientific publishing, not publishing at the sort of general audience news level, but in the scientific journal level, is that these are all peer reviewed. And by peers, they mean other scientists, experts in the various areas that a study overlaps. And so what's written up and submitted to a journal, it's very technical, it's very detailed. Up on the slide here is just one figure from this paper. There's a lot of information going on, and the authors are trying to get a lot of ideas and a lot of interpretations across. And then those go to other scientists, and the scientists look at those materials, and they look at the data in there, they look at the interpretations of it, and they just do a lot of double checking, and not only recognizing if everything in there is correct, but they also suggest how to improve things that may be overlooked or forgotten. And there's one key thing that these journals are all having in common. So, or what these articles all have in common. And so what's kind of the flow of these articles, Gavin? It's following something that we kind of talked about last week.
That's right. Yeah, the articles are all set up in a way that scientists can read and understand the thought process of the science. And so what we talked about last week was the scientific method. And so oftentimes these articles are sectioned out into the scientific method so that the reader can start reading, and they actually start off with this thing called an abstract, which is sort of a synopsis, but then it goes into the background information, any observations they had, their data analysis, the methods for analyzing. So it's all very technical, and the scientists that are doing the work really have to cross their T's and dot their I's and make sure that they are defending their project, and that the reader knows that their science is backed up by good reason and good analyses.
Yeah. And so we've spent a lot of time writing and reviewing, and that's a big thing we spend a lot of our time doing, in addition to collecting that data. And so this, when we think about this process, this is sort of the end product of what we were talking about last week, right? And that's right. Yeah. The collection of data.
That's right. Yeah, Graham. And so we did talk about this last week, but just in terms of getting the audience up to speed on what these specific Antarctic scientists are doing and how they draw their conclusions. Well, the first thing they're doing is sampling. And so traditional sampling is something like you see up here on the top right, and that's me up in the Sierras digging a hole and picking up some dirt. But Antarctic sampling is a little bit different. And the important take-home message for the audience today about this is that sampling and data collection can be not very technical. There's me with a shovel, or it can be a pretty arduous process. And especially for Antarctic science, you have to get people down to Antarctica. So that right there is a long journey. But all of the rocks are covered by a mile of ice. So Graham, can you talk about some of the data collection and sample collection processes that specifically these Antarctic scientists were doing in this study?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So like you mentioned, a big part of the field work is just getting down there in the first place. And then and that involves plane rides, and sometimes a lot of these places you're taking one plane to Antarctica and then another plane to your field site. Sometimes you're on big snow tractors, building camps, having all these different people and instruments and machines coordinated. And then in the case of this Thwaites Glacier study, they were boring a hole through 2,000 feet of ice. So no easy task in order to get to that water, where they then started dipping in things instruments to take measurements, or maybe collecting some samples to study back in labs. But sometimes there's an even more high-tech way to work around even having to get somewhere, Gavin. And that's what was used in that paper paper headline we just looked at. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. So a lot of times for Antarctica in particular, you'll see the papers have these beautiful maps, and a lot of times they're maps of the bedrock topography. And so that's a field of study we call remote sensing. And remote sensing is a way of getting data or maps of the Earth from satellites. And so this particular paper is getting satellite imagery from Antarctica and drawing conclusions from that imagery. And so, Graham, this is not a trivial process. You just told me that they have to go there. There's probably a lot of money involved. And I'm curious, do you just come up with an idea and get started, or is there like an extra step to the process when it comes to science?
Oh, Gavin, as we know all too well, it's not just that easy as having a good idea. Often what we need to do as scientists is we need to write proposals for money. And so there's a lot of different organizations out there, many of them funded by the government, with specific goals for having better understandings of our natural systems or technologies on Earth. And so, there's all sorts of places like the National Science Foundation or NASA or the National Institute of Health that have funding, that have money that are available for folks to do research with. But it's not as easy as just asking for it, right, Gavin?
That's right, Graham. This is actually a very big and very important process of doing science, and that is generating money to do the science. We, just like everybody else, need money to do what we want to do. And so this process starts off with the scientists having a really good idea. And oftentimes it's a collaborative idea. So it's many scientists trying to get money for one project. And then they write up the whole idea in this long essay, sometimes 15 pages long, sometimes more, depending on how big the grant is. And they then submit the grant to an agency, one of these like you have up here. And Graham, does everybody get money after that? If you have a good idea, you're just going to get money, right?
No, Gavin, these grants are very competitive. There's, lots of scientists out there, all with very good ideas. And so they're all kind of throwing their hats into the ring here. And only about 10% of, at least grants in like NSF or NASA, which are the ones we're most familiar with, only about 10% of those ever really get funded. So a lot of times there's a repetition to it where you submit a proposal, the funding is denied for it, but you get some feedback on it, and you're always finding smarter, better ways to ask for the money more efficiently, ways to do the research more thoughtfully, and hopefully, and oftentimes with a lot of revisions and working on it, these grants will eventually get funded so that the research can get done, but just in the best way possible.
Got it, Graham. Okay, so you told me that you get reviews back on these grants. And so who reads them? Like, who decides who gets the grant?
Oh, great question, Gavin. Just like the publication process, there's often a panel of other scientists who are familiar with the field, and they bring their thoughts, to the table to assess the quality of these grants, or the potential of them. And so there's a lot of this sort of exchange among scientists in this peer review realm where we're all sort of working together to critique each other's work and find the best ways we can go about it. And Gavin, when we were talking about this, you brought up, an idea that I really enjoyed, and that's sort of the life cycle of science. So we went all the way from the news article back to getting the funds to do the research in the first place. But can you share with us a little bit about that life cycle of scientific research?
Totally, yeah. And so we kind of went through it, but just to go back over it, you start off with your idea, you get a bunch of your science colleagues, and you put a grant into one of these funding agencies. You hopefully get funding, you start the research, you go to the place, you get the rocks, and then you take them back to your lab, or you take the data back to your lab, and you do the scientific method. And this is what we talked about last week. You experiment, you look at your hypothesis, try to falsify it, and then you draw a conclusion. Once you draw a conclusion, this is actually something that you've been going through recently with one of your papers, Graham. So someone got wind of this really cool paper you wrote, and what happened?
Yeah, and so sometimes people catch wind of it through a university or through the journals, or sometimes someone knows a person to write stuff up. But a big part of the sort of the after a paper has been written up, you reach out to you try and communicate with the public press so that you can communicate with them and help them write a news article in whatever form you can, and help share those ideas to bring it out to the public, to keep the public engaged and interested. And that kind of helps to keep these the wheels of the scientific cycle turning. And so it's science. There's a lot that goes into it. It's not just sitting in front of an instrument, but it's all a pretty dynamic and exciting process.
That's right, Graham. And I'm glad that the sort of end product is not just some scientific conclusion that gets buried in a journal somewhere, and that you actually have journalists that come and interview you and write up stories about it. Because there's something I've noticed that you had in pretty much all of these funding agencies, and they either start with the letters N or US, and that's because they are nationally funded agencies. It's literally most of the time taxpayer dollars that wind up paying for this science. They're allocated from the government to these agencies from taxpayer money. And so we really do, as scientists, have an obligation to get our ideas out there to the public and to get people excited and learning more. And so that's really what I think is a really a nice part about science and a rewarding part about science.
I couldn't agree more, Gavin. It's nice to be able to, pay it forward and share what we find with the people who are all standing behind it. So yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
It's nice.
So I think we've done it, right? We've gone through the whole process, and I think that now hopefully the audience feels like they understand the process from conclusion to your news feed a little bit better. What do you think, Marisa?
Extra. I got some breaking news for you guys. That was wonderful. I enjoyed it a lot. And speaking of basically what we've been talking about today, I just wanted to point out that what you guys do for us every week, I think, is an extension of what you were just saying, both of you, about communicating your work and the obligation that you have to do that too, kind of. But I'm also grateful that you take the time to not only share the work that you're doing in your lab, but also going above and beyond by doing these programs for our community. So I just want to take a moment to thank you again, as always.
Our pleasure.
Our pleasure indeed.
And if anyone watching has any final questions for Gavin and Graham about how this all works, or where your science news comes from, or favorite stories of science in the news that have been coming up, let us know. But maybe I guess I have a question for you guys. If you want to talk a little bit about beyond these articles, like beyond Scientific American and beyond the New York Times, do you have any favorite ways that you receive science news, maybe a little off the beaten path?
I would have to think. Do you have any that come to your mind, Graham?
Well, so something that I've just probably in the last year started doing as I've started to grow up as a scientist is actually going to the scientific journals that interest me and having them send me their new publications. I get like an email newsletter, much like many of us get our NPR or New York Times or, whatever newsletter in the morning. I started to sign up to those from the journal. So I'm getting some of these things, hot off the press and seeing stuff that's going on in my field as I'm trying to, get to know the science better all the time. But
that's right. Yeah. And everybody can do that, right, Graham? You just go to, so some interesting journals that people might want to try that have very broad scientific articles are Nature and Science, the journal Nature and the journal Science. They're both very, very broad reaching, and they take sort of the most interesting and novel projects from all different kinds. So right now there's a lot of COVID research in there. If you're trying to get interested, like right in the ground floor, they'll send you newsletters. So anybody can do it. Just go to their website.
Yeah, great suggestion, Gavin. Nature and Science those have some really cool and exciting things in them.
That's right. And then as you go further, there are some more niche journals as well. And I would also add one more thing. I think that I don't personally have a Twitter, but on social media, there's a lot of scientists that have a pretty big presence. So everyone from Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye the Science Guy, all the way down to the scientists who are actually doing the work. So if you ever see someone in the news, you see someone like mentioned in a news article, check them out on Twitter. Oftentimes they'll have a Twitter that they have up to the minute updates on what they're doing. So yeah,
that's a great suggestion. I think a lot of the times people feel like there's this like wall between academia and the public, and in some ways there is, but there are a lot of people out there who are actively communicating their work, and it's just about being looped into these things, and social media can be your friend as well as your foe. Speaking of, like communicating science, and I think this has been really helpful for all of us who are navigating through, understanding the headlines for a lot of science news that is very hot button at the moment. And so this is a good reminder to know that there's always more places for you to dig into beyond just the clickbait headline, which is so prevalent nowadays. So, so thanks for the reminder, guys. And thanks for everyone joining us. Maybe do you want to give us a little teaser about what we're going to be talking about next week?
Yes.
So we're going to keep channeling our science news, science interview, sort of vibe right now. And so next week we will be interviewing a colleague of ours who's a geochronologist like me and Gavin, but has been focusing on a specific topic that we keep coming back to. He's an expert in the timing of mass extinctions.
That's right. Yes.
Cool. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation about science today and what's happening today, not just with your guys' work, but also other people in your lab. So that's going to be really fun. So everyone, join us again next week for more of the Rockin Pop-Up, and you can again go back in the archives and watch previous examples too. So we'll see y'all again next week.